Good morning. One of the things we're going to see today in our verses that we're going to be looking at is, if we take these verses out of context, we're going to see a major theological problem. Because these verses appear to say something, if taken out of context, that they're really not saying. In context, it's fairly understandable, but out of context, we would have problems. The other thing we need to understand, we didn't have it read this morning, but you can't separate these from verse 11. One of the things I mentioned before, it's very difficult to find breaking points in Romans, because you could almost start in 1:1 and go right through about for chapter 12, verse 6, and say, okay, that's one thought. Well, try to break that up and put it into sermons, and you've got a real challenge. So sometimes there's a little bit of overlap here. So I also want to read verse 11, which says, "For there is no partiality with God." And that's really the start of this little section here. And that has to be connected, and we'll explain that. The other thing also that has to be understood about this section is, some of the verses don't make sense because Paul is not yet talking about true Christian salvation and how to be saved. Remember, chapter 1 started talking about some things, then chapter 1 went into, this is how Gentiles think you make it in life. This is how you get to heaven on the Gentile way. And yet this is the path of destruction for the Gentiles. Chapter 2 started with, this is the Jewish way. This is how the Jews have told you to do it. But it's not going to be until chapter 3, verse 20 or 21, that Paul actually gets to, here's the real gospel. Because right now, remember, Paul's setting the scene so that people can actually understand not just the truth, but also these false ways that are being presented to them also. The theme of this section that you need to keep in mind as we interpret this, and it'll help you to interpret it, is that God is impartial and that everyone deserves punishment, without exception. There's no one who's good enough to make it on their own. Now, one of the things I remember when I was a child, I was about 12 or 13 years old, would have been about 1972, 73, somewhere in that area. I got the mumps, and it was a very bad case of the mumps for like 3 weeks. I went back to school for 1 or 2 days, and then got what was called the London flu. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the London flu, but it was a particularly nasty flu that year, and I ended up having the London flu for 2 weeks. And one of the symptoms of the London flu was a very high fever. And one of the things I had, the doctor was actually coming to the house to visit me, but the hospitals were overflowing. Doctor could only get there every so often. My temperature for quite a while, I mean for days, was hanging around 102 to 104. So a pretty nasty flu. Kept trying to break the fever. It didn't break. Finally one night, I get up, I get out of bed. It had been right at 104. We've been tracking it, 104. And I got out of bed and I'm walking around and I say, hey, Mom, Dad, it broke. I feel great. Oh, it's so wonderful to feel good now that this has happened. Not only I didn't just feel good, I felt great. I mean, I felt like I was on drugs or something like that. I don't know what it feels like, but whatever it is, it was almost a little bit euphoric. I was like, oh, this is beautiful. Not only that, life is so much better than it used to be, and my fever is just gone, and I got no pain whatsoever. That's when we took the temperature and found out my temperature had gone to 107. And at 107, they said, it's time to get in the car. And they took me to the hospital. As a matter of fact, it took more than 8 hours for the hospital to get me down to 103. They couldn't discharge me until they got me down to 103. The fact is that I was deceiving myself and I was delusional because, as I said, once I got to 107, life was looking good. The reason I bring this up is it's the same thing we have here with the Jews Paul's talking about in this chapter. What he's saying is, you guys think that life is so good, you're following the law, you got God just nailed down, and you have deluded yourself because you are not even close to the truth. Absolute self-delusion. Same thing that was happening to me was happening to them back then. Now if we look in verse 12 says, for all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. A little bit twisted up language, so we have to understand what it says. If you look at the verse as a whole, the first thing it's saying is that there is a standard that is required in order for sin to exist. Without a law, you don't have sin. Without some kind of law, you don't have sin. We've talked about it before. Is it illegal to drive 100 miles an hour? Well, around here it certainly is, but back when I used to drive through Montana once or twice, it wasn't, and it was fun, trust me. You could drive 100 miles an hour during the day and nobody cared, it was legal. It was reasonable and proper. The law establishes right and wrong. And remember, we're talking in general now, because there's not only the Mosaic law that the Jews had, but there was also the natural revelation that everyone else had to say there is a God and you should know better. In addition to that, people had their own conscience that was put into them. So for example, everyone should be able to know from youth, do not murder, do not steal. Now, they can sear that conscience, they can burn that conscience away, but ultimately, everyone has been given some kind of law that they can understand. That's why what we're talking about here, he starts with talking, when he says, for all who have sinned without the law, that law there he's talking about is the Mosaic law. And who is without the law, without the Mosaic law? All the Gentiles. You go up to a Gentile back then and you start talking about, well, the Ten Commandments and, when Moses did this, and they're going like, what are you talking about? They had no idea what that was. They weren't going to follow the Mosaic law because they didn't even know anything about the Mosaic law. Gentiles didn't know that. So those without the law would have been the Gentiles. And what he's saying is, for those who have sinned without the law, the Gentiles will also perish without the law, meaning the Mosaic law, meaning that God is not going to judge the Gentiles according to the Mosaic law, but they're still going to be judged. Because they're going to be judged according to what they knew, and what they knew is there is a need for a Savior. No one's exempt from that. It's not like, well, he wasn't smart enough and therefore he didn't get... No, that's not what it's talking about. The fact is, everyone has enough knowledge to know that there is a God and that we are sinners. And what he's saying is these Gentiles will be judged according to that. That's what we talk about when we talk about natural revelation in our conscience. The other thing also that comes up as a question from this a lot of times is, well, wait a second, if the Gentiles didn't know as much and are going to be judged according to a different standard, does that mean there are different levels of hell? My question to you is, does it matter? I mean, really, let's say there are different levels of hell, and it's 1,000,000 degrees hotter in the worst place in hell. Okay, well, still, if it's 5,000,000 degrees in the best place, does it matter? Just like real estate, when you die, it's all location, location, location. You're either in heaven or hell. I don't care what your address is in hell. It's still not a good place. So I kind of take that debate about different levels of hell. There might be, but I don't really care if there's different levels of hell because it doesn't matter. The fact is, no matter what hell is, we know that hell is living onwards, but completely separated from God. We don't really know. We know some details about hell. We don't know what it is entirely. But we know that it is complete separation from God. We know that it is absolute torture. And we know that it doesn't stop. Now, if we take the last half of this verse, Paul also talked about, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. What's he mean there? Those under the law are the Jews. You guys knew about the Mosaic law. Therefore, God is saying, I'm going to hold you to the standard that I set forth. That standard that I set forth is, here's the Mosaic law, you didn't follow it. So you got problems. So they are going to receive a harsher judgment from God. Again, I don't know how it's harsher, because again, to me, hell sounds like hell and whatever. But the fact is that somehow they're held to a higher standard here. If you think about it, we really do this also. If a 6-year-old child walks into a 7-Eleven and steals a candy bar, it's not good. But we hold that 6-year-old child to a different standard than if a 30-year-old walks in, deliberately takes the candy bar, puts it in his pocket, and walks out the door. They're both wrong. But the 6-year-old doesn't have the same comprehension of what he's done. He may know it's wrong, but he doesn't have the same level of depth as the 30-year-old does. Even in the church we do that. We hold elders to a different standard than we do other people. Does that mean we should all be righteous or something? No. Or we should forget about righteousness? No. What it means is we all have an obligation to be righteous, but to maintain being an elder, you have to do certain things. I shouldn't say have to do certain things, but you can't do certain things and be an elder. And that's fair. That's the way it should be. The fact is, people are held accountable. I feel that God will hold me accountable more for teaching than he will for other people for teaching. Why? Because to what God has given us, he expects us to use. That's our spiritual gift. So the fact is, we do this ourselves, but somehow God is going to hold the Jews to a higher standard because he gave them the law and they knew about it. They knew completely who God was, and they should have been able to know what to do, and known still it was salvation by faith. Instead of salvation by faith, they turned it into a salvation by works system. which never worked. No pun intended. If we go to verse 13, it says, "For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law will be justified." Now that sounds like works-based salvation, doesn't it? If you do the law, you're going to be justified. If you hear the law, you're not going to be justified. It's not works-based salvation. Remember the context. First off, this is the Jewish way of salvation, but also Paul is saying something which is true here, is that the people who are the hearers of the law are the people who have given intellectual assent to it. Yes, I know this is the law. I may even follow that law, but I don't like it. Doesn't mean I'm going to like it just because I'm going to follow it. So the hearers of the law, it's never sunk in. Why would it matter to distinguish between the hearers of the law and the doers of the law? Because the doers of the law are those who are doing the law because it's a reflection of their inner faith. Because there were many Jews that were saved because they followed the law, but the law never saved them. They were saved by faith, and because they were saved by faith, their actions reflected that internal faith. That's what he's talking about doers of the law. The hearers of the law, pious people without conversion. The Pharisees that Jesus talked about were a classic example. And not that all Pharisees were unsaved either. We have a couple of them in the Bible that are mentioned in the New Testament that were good Pharisees. But in general, the Pharisees were hypocrites. They were hearers of the law without being doers of the law. If we go on to verse 14 and 15, fortunately here it gets even more confusing for us. In 14 and 15 it starts off, For when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, those having the law are a law to them. Those not having the law are a law to themselves, in that they show the works of the law written in their hearts. It doesn't work when you flip 2 pages at once. For they show the laws written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them. The first thing we see here is what appears to be saying, aha, here's how the Gentiles can work their way to heaven. That's not what it's saying at all. And I'm going to give you some reasons for that. But at first glance, it looks like, again, 13 through 15 is works-based salvation. It is confusing, but it's got to be looked at. Now, there's one thing that you are not going to see in the English, okay? If you look at this in the beginning of verse 14, it says, For when Gentiles who do not have the law instinctively do the things of the law. It's really not quite that way in the original Greek. It's a good interpretation, but not necessarily the best translation. Because what we have here is we have a conditional particle in the beginning of this sentence. And the meaning of this conditional participle is, just for the sake of argument. Now, you wouldn't translate that into English, but that's what it's actually meaning. So the first thing Paul is saying is, I'm not saying Gentiles can be saved through works, but just for the sake of argument, let's talk about a Gentile who does follow the law. The second thing is, and again, you're only going to see this in the original, Gentiles is normally in the original as the Gentiles, even if it's not translated that way. Suddenly here, Paul goes to translating it as Gentiles without the definite article. Now, the reason that's important is he actually did the same thing for the Jews. And again, I don't want to get too technical on you here. But he did the same thing earlier in chapter 2 for the Jews. And when he did this, he was speaking more generically. So this is generically just for the sake of argument. It does not mean Gentiles can suddenly work their way to heaven. Also, if you'll notice, it never actually says the Gentiles are saved. But the real key here is Paul saying that, think about it. If you're not following the law, if they were to follow the law, and it's only a theoretical possibility here, because again, following the law meant more than just doing the works of the law, but it meant an internal faith in Christ, or at that time in the Messiah coming to save them. So again, these verses are a little confusing, but it's because of how we've had them translated that they're confusing. The other thing that's confusing is context. These verses are never to show how Gentiles get saved. If you think that, we've missed the point of the verses. What's the point of these verses? The point of these verses is to say everyone is condemned, but specifically here, the Jews are particularly condemned because they knew better. So he's not saying this to praise the Gentiles, but he's saying it to condemn the Jews who didn't have faith in the Messiah. Because they should have been at a higher standard because they were given more to work with than to start with. The other thing, too, this ties into sometimes, actually, let me skip that. Let me go to this. In the end of this also, it talks about the Gentiles. In 14, it says, they are a law to themselves. Some people think a law to themselves means, oh, they can do whatever they want. If they say it's right, anything goes. That's not at all what that means. What this is saying is they are following the law themselves instinctively without even realizing why. So he's not talking about, the key here is, more than thinking about can Gentiles be saved through works, because they can't, no one can. What he's really saying is, look, guys, theoretically if this could happen, fine, but here's what I'm saying is, as Jews you're even more condemned because you had the knowledge, you had the law up front, you should have known better. Gentiles, they're still just as much sinners, maybe even more, but they didn't know as much. Now if we look at verse 16, verse 16 says, on the day when according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Christ Jesus. The first thing we want to look here at is verse 6. Because verse 6 and 16 are actually connected to each other. 6 says, who will render to every man according to his deeds. So it's starting to talk about God's judgment in the future here. In 7 through 15, it goes to the present. And it's talking about things that are happening. In 16, he links up back with 6 again and says, now that I've talked about these side issues, remember, God's going to judge everyone. And the reason I say this is because the context of it all is everyone's going to be judged. Jews or Gentiles, doesn't matter. You don't have a way to God without Christ. Period. So 6 and 16 actually connect with each other. When we get to 17 through 21a, or the first part of 21, is really one thought here. We're going to look at each phrase for a reason, but it's really one thought here talking about basically, you scumbags, what are you doing? What were you thinking? In 17, he starts off with, but if you bear the name Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God, let me stop right there. What is rely upon the law? Rely upon the law literally means, Paul saying, works-based salvation. You think that just by following the Mosaic law, you're going to get to heaven. That's what he's talking about. Is anyone getting to heaven through the Mosaic law? No. Only way to heaven is faith in Christ. Christ's righteousness applied to our account. Even if they didn't know about Christ beforehand, they knew the Messiah was coming. Faith in the coming Messiah to pay for their sins. The law was never meant to save. The law was meant to show the faith that existed beneath the works. So when he says relying upon the law, he's talking about, you guys have missed the point if you're just relying on your works to save you. If you look at the Jews of that day, the Jews frequently rely, and I'm talking about the believing Jews here, I'm talking about the nation of Israel and the Jews who had not believed in Christ. Through their history, for hundreds of years, they had two things they ended up relying on for their salvation, and both were wrong. The first was the law. We do the right things, therefore we're getting in. The second was their birthright. And they shouldn't have been relying on that either, because that's kind of like saying, because I was born into the right family, I'm going to heaven. That's not how it works. The birthright thing is, it's crazy. The idea of the birthright is, because I'm a child of Jacob, I'm going to heaven. That's not what the Bible says, but that's what they believed. It got to the point where it became their birthright and based on the law. Their works should have been demonstrating their faith. That's why it was done. Now, if we look at the end of 17, it's also interesting. It says, rely on the law and boast in God. Well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Haven't you gone to people and say, look what God's done for me this week. Isn't he a wonderful, great God? We walk into church. Aren't you blessed today? Yeah, so what's wrong with boasting in God? Well, that's not actually what it means when he talks about boasting in God here. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I was to say to you, my wife picked the best husband in the world. Wait a second, how did that come out that way? Or, my dad had the greatest kids in the world. That's not really boasting about my wife or my father, that's boasting about me. That's turning it around and saying, look at me because of how wonderful I am, I was picked. That's what Paul meant by boasting in God. The Jews were saying, look at how wonderful we are, we're children of Jacob, we're Israelites, we're in, God picked us. They're not boasting in God. What they're really doing is boasting about God to show how wonderful they were. It was actually, their idea of boasting in God was incredibly narcissistic. But that's what they were doing. In verse 18, again, remember, all of this one section here, 17 through the beginning of 21, is basically Paul saying, you unrighteous fools, you don't even understand what you're talking about. And I'm not pointing at anybody individually here, please. Just happen to say it that way. You unrighteous fools, how do you do this? Verse 18, he says, and know his will and approve the things that are essential, being instructed out of the law. First thing it says here is know his will. What's Paul talking about? He's saying you knew better. You knew the will of God. You knew what God wanted you to do. He gave you the law. You knew there was a coming Messiah. You knew all of these things. Now don't try to turn around and say I didn't know. You should have known better. It also says here in verse 18, and approve the things that are essential, being instructed out of the law. Approving the good from the law, what he's saying here is you gave verbal assent to the law, but you never took it into your heart. You never took the whole meaning of it into your heart. I get sick every time I hear politicians talk about cutting the budget. Have you ever looked at what they actually mean by cutting the budget? They use words that you and I would never use the same way. When they say, for example, we cut the budget by 3% next year, to me and you that would mean, oh, you're going to spend 3% less than you spent this year, right? That ain't what they mean. What they mean is they proposed 8% spending maybe, and they're only going to spend 5% more. So we cut the budget by 3%. I'm not kidding. That's literally what they're doing. I know it sounds hilarious. You know, it's funny. If it weren't for the fact that they're doing this, it'd be a comedy act. But they're actually doing that when they say budget cuts. It's insane. But it's giving verbal assent to what's right, but never taking it to heart. It's the same thing Paul was talking about here. They knew what was right, but instead of doing what's right, they'd use these verbal gymnastics to get around it. Just like the politicians today. It was kind of sickening, and I think Paul saw that. It's filled with hypocrisy the whole way through. When we get to 19 goes even further. It says, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind. I love that illustration, by the way. A light to those who are in darkness. Isn't that wonderful? Guiding people through darkness who are blind and can't see. But he's not actually saying that they are a guide to the blind. He's saying that you think you're a guide to the blind. You have confidence in yourself that you're a guide to the blind. Teachers are held to a higher standard than other people. Whether it's by God or frankly even in the schools they should be held to a higher standard. A teacher should know things that maybe people in the general public don't know. A teacher should be an expert in their field. That's the way it's normal. The fact is, in this case, they were trying to be teachers and they didn't have a clue what they were doing to start with. One of the things I will never forget is one client that I went years ago to, and they asked me to do an evaluation of not only their computer network, but also of their personnel. And I ran into a guy that literally was the single most arrogant computer worker I have ever run into. And also one of the most ignorant. I got news for you. Combine arrogance and ignorance, you have dangerous. And that's what he was. In some cases, some of the things that he had tried to fix for, I was told, 6 to 9 months. One of my guys went in and fixed in 30 minutes. And then apologized because it took him 30 minutes to fix it. And they're going, he's been working on that since September. You know, it was insane. But he was ignorant and arrogant combined, and that's what we had here with these people. Arrogance. We are the children of God. We know best. We got the law. We know it all. And complete ignorance. That's what you're looking at. Now, what's also interesting is this word here. It says I'm reading NASB, and are confident that you yourselves are a guide. That's not quite what it says in the original, and the original is, I think, more explicit and even better. Because what you have in the original, if you're a grammarian, I'm going to give you the technical explanation first, and then I'm going to explain what that means. The technical explanation is, confident is actually a second person plural verb with a reflexive pronoun sitting after it. Now that's a fancy way of saying you have convinced yourself. The reflexive pronoun is this yourself type of thing. You have persuaded yourself that you're an expert in this. You've convinced yourself that you are a guide to the blind. It's not saying you're confident that you're a guide to the blind. It's saying you've convinced yourself of this. It's horrible when you think about this. A self-proclaimed expert who's a complete idiot, and ignorant, I shouldn't say idiot, but completely ignorant. That's what he's saying. It wasn't just that they'd been labeled as confident or they were confident, but they proclaimed themselves to be the experts. And that's what he's actually talking about. It's really in the original, it's actually a wonderful little phrase to read in the original to see. It's almost like this beautiful sarcasm that Paul is using about them if you read it there. In addition to that, if we go to verse 20, he continues on. A corrector of the foolish. Well, that sounds good, but a teacher of the immature, having the law, the embodiment of knowledge, and of the truth. Corrector of the foolish. Again, acting like they have knowledge they don't. I will never forget reading a story many, many years ago about a Hollywood executive. And I'm going to edit the words a little bit because some of the words I wouldn't use. But one of the things that happened with this guy is he was confronted by somebody that knew him and said, "You are one of the most immoral guys that I have ever met." And it got down to the point where they're arguing. They're both immoral, but they're both arguing about who's more immoral and who's worse and who's worse. And one guy says to this Hollywood producer, Hollywood executive, he says, "I bet you don't even know the Lord's Prayer." So they get going on this and they bet like $100 that he doesn't know the Lord's Prayer. So finally they got the bet. It's probably 50 years ago now. But they got the bet. The guy bows his head and he says, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." And continues onward. And finishes. And the other guy pulls his wallet out, takes $100 out and said, "I didn't think you knew it." A teacher of the foolish who is ignorant himself. That's what that was. Two people who were completely ignorant. They had no knowledge whatsoever of what was going on. That's what you got here. And it's not that they didn't know the law. They probably could have written you back then. They could have given you each jot and tittle of what the law said. But they missed the whole point. The law wasn't to save. It was to point to the Messiah that was going to come. That's what the law was about. And that's why it says in verse 20, that's why it talks about the law of truth at the end of knowledge of the truth. They should have known this. The law contained the truth pointing to the Messiah. They didn't want to hear that. They wanted a way to work their way to heaven. And trust me, working your way to heaven will never work. No pun intended. Now if we look at verse 21. 21 continues on. You therefore who teach one another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one should not steal, do you steal? This section about teachers need to teach themselves. When I started my business, years ago, when I was working for myself, before I started taking on employees, in computer networking, I studied. I picked up books. I've never taken a class in computer, surprise people, I've never taken a class in computer networking, even though I'm a senior network engineer. However, I've read voluminous number of books on it. And in addition to reading the books, I also used to take these networks and set them up in my house. I had more complicated networks in my house sometimes. Linda can verify this. She told me to put them away too many times. But anyway, I had too many, and legitimately so. They were all over the place. I had networks on my house that would have shamed some of the businesses. And I set up deliberately complex networks so that I could practice on them. And not only that, I passed, I don't know for sure, but somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 certification exams, where you go into a room with a computer, and you sit there and you get quizzed on it. I mean, just to get my first Master C&E was 12 exams. And I mean, hour-long exam, 2-hour exams that were rather tough exams. But over the years, back then, I haven't taken an exam probably in, at least 10 years now. But I passed about 50 of them to get my certifications, and I don't even know what certifications I have anymore, pretty much. But the point is, I taught myself and worked at learning. I didn't just set myself up and say, I'm an expert. No, I actually did that. To do things like when I have gone to court and testified as an expert witness. That didn't come about simply because I proclaimed I'm an expert. It meant I took the time to teach myself and be taught. The fact is, this is what he's talking about here. You can't be a teacher until you've been taught. They wanted to teach without learning. And that's what he's talking about. They're hypocrites. Not only that, they're self-righteous thieves and adulterers. In 21 it says, you preach that you should not steal, yet you steal. Have you ever noticed that oftentimes the people who are doing the worst things are the ones screaming the loudest about other people and what they're doing? I don't know about you, but this year I'm getting pretty sick looking at the elections. Because all I hear is, and I'm legitimately, liar, 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 evil, bad. And the truth is they are liars. And I don't mean just the two leading candidates. I mean even the little independents and stuff like that. They're all liars this year. It's amazing how low our society has sunk to get to the point where we put the candidates up that we put up this year. But if you think about it, the screaming and the yelling, often what they scream loudest about is what they do themselves. You got Hillary screaming that Trump is a liar. You got Trump screaming that Hillary is a liar. And not to take sides here, but when I hear that, here's what came back to me. I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but in 2008, Hillary Clinton talked about her visit to Bosnia in 1996. Here's what she said. I remember landing under sniper fire. There was supposed to be some kind of a greeting ceremony at the airport, but instead we just ran with our heads down to get into the vehicles to get to our base. Wow! That's a real hero story. Sniper fire all around, putting your head down, forget the greeting ceremony, just run to your vehicles and get to the base. Well, there's a little problem with that. When the video came out, come out, sure, walking out of the back of the airplane smiling. Not only that, all the other people on the airplane with her said, snipers? What are you talking about? Not only that, there's a video of her going down and meeting with an 8-year-old child who gives her a gift and hugging the little child and greeting. The greeting ceremony went off. All of it, I don't know if she blew a gasket or if she just flat out that big a liar or what. But the fact is, all of it was a lie. Not only that, her excuse was it was such a dangerous area that the president couldn't go there. Interesting. One of the people that traveled with her is the comedian Sinbad. What did he have to say about it? What kind of president would say, hey man, I can't go because I might get shot, so I'm going to send my wife. Oh, and take a guitar player and a comedian with you, because that's who she had on the helicopter with her. Now, I'm not trying to take sides here. What I'm trying to say is think about this. A person who is an absolute habitual liar, who absolutely could not tell the truth if her life depended on it, calling another habitual liar a liar. And I could have turned it around and taken an example from Trump probably too. The point is, they're all liars, but what do? They scream the loudest about what they do themselves. That's what you had here. You had the Jews of that day saying, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't do these things. And yet that's exactly what they were doing. They have the same thing going on now. Nothing's changed. We just dress it up a little fancier nowadays and broadcast it worldwide on the media. But the fact is, these are the people, the ones screaming don't do it, that were the exact people that were doing it. By the way, with Hillary Clinton, you'll be interested, if you remember the end of that story, I should have said, at the end of that story, she was finally confronted with it over and over, and after the videos came out, you know what she said? I misspoke. Never said she lied. Never even said she was wrong. Said, I misspoke. To this day, she has never admitted lying about that. If that doesn't fit what I'm seeing here in verse 24, and again, you could take Trump, Clinton, Johnson, and Jill, whoever, or whatever, and apply it to pretty much all of them, because they're all doing this. But especially Trump and Clinton, man, they couldn't tell the truth if their lives depended on it. Same thing here. Scream the loudest, divert attention from what you're doing. The next thing we see here in verse 22, you who say that, should not commit adultery, we'll talk about that. You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? It's an interesting verse, because is he trying to say they're actually stealing from the temple in Jerusalem? Some people think that. They're wrong. Okay, I think they're wrong. They're not stealing from the temple in Jerusalem. That would have been unthinkable at that time, especially for a Jew, because honestly, you couldn't have even gotten out of that place with that. The priests would have been guarding it. They weren't stealing from that. But here's what they were doing. For centuries, they had stolen from pagan temples when God said don't. Remember Achan with Ai and Achan, where God killed him and killed his family and everything else? Why? Because God said, don't take a thing from this city. And he just took a few little things for himself. Well, that had been going on for quite a while. And actually, let me illustrate this. Something you'll find interesting here. Let me ask you a question. If I said to you, who's heard about Roe versus Wade? Tell me about that. Put up your hands if you've heard of Roe versus Wade. Okay, most of the hands, if not every hand in here, goes up. Okay, who's heard about New London, Connecticut and can tell me all about New London, Connecticut? One person, and me. And two, I think, maybe now. In my opinion, New London, Connecticut, not to Roe versus Wade, probably one of the 5 worst Supreme Court decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. And nobody even knows what it was. And it's recent. It's like 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. New London, Connecticut wanted to use something called eminent domain. Eminent domain said when the government needs something, they can go in and take it. You need a road built here, you need a hospital built here, you can take it. But it was always intended for the public good. New London, Connecticut came up with a new twist to that. If we want more money, we can take people's houses. So they literally took an entire section of the city and said, we're taking it at our price, not yours, and we're going to give that to developers to build up big things so we can get a bigger tax return. If you know anything about our Constitution or our country, or frankly just right and wrong, that's horrifying. The Supreme Court agreed with them. And the Supreme Court made it the law of the land that a city or town or whatever state can take whatever they want from you, even though it's private property, just for the purpose of getting more money for themselves. The irony of it is, in the end, they won the Supreme Court decision and the developers backed out. They got rid of all the people, and the houses pretty much rotted and fell to the ground, and now nobody, at least I don't know, maybe they do now, but nobody was living there. The fact is that what they were doing, the state was saying, for a profit motive, I'm willing to do this. Now, why did I bring up a Supreme Court case about eminent domain? It's a good question. There's a reason. Because the Jews of that day were probably not going into the pagan temples and stealing from them, and hadn't been for the history of it. Oh, we wouldn't actually take the idols from there. No way. But the Jewish merchants made an active trade in things stolen from temples, including idols. I mean, think about it. We're not stealing it. We're just the fences. We're just the guys who make it so that you can do this. The fact is that all they looked at was profit, just like the Supreme Court there. It's just profit. If we can make some money on this thing, it's okay. They weren't doing it themselves. They weren't going to get their hands dirty. State wasn't going to knock down those houses. Just like in this case, I don't think, from what the history teaches us, I don't think that many of the Jews were actually stealing the idols themselves. But think about this. You're going to take the idols and then you're going to make an active market for it. And not only that, at least if it's a gold idol, melt it down. I mean, don't sell it as an idol. They were selling it for religious reasons for the other religions. They knew better. This is the kind of stuff Paul's accusing them. As a matter of fact, one thing that's not brought out here, in old times in the Old Testament, stealing from a pagan temple was right up there with murder and some of those other capital offenses. It was one of the major things you could do. If outside the Bible you can look at this also. It was really a major offense. And yet Paul's saying, you guys think you're teachers, you guys think you're wise, you think you're following the law. This is what you're doing. We get to 23. You who boast in the law, though you're breaking the law, do you dishonor God? I love the way he puts that. You're boasting in the law, but you're the ones breaking and dishonoring God. Think about this. It would be better for them to have never said they were Jews connected to God than to say what they did. At least you would have said, oh, it's just more pagans doing stuff pagans do. It's just like when I saw the guy a couple months ago speeding down the shoulder on 214 with his Christian bumper stickers and fish on the back of it, passing all of us at 80 miles an hour as he goes down the shoulder. I don't think God said, praise the Lord, that honors me. Happens all the time. Look at Nazi Germany. You know, in Nazi Germany, Hitler passed, let me say this, something that's not well understood. Bible-believing true Christians that were fundamentalists, or I shouldn't say fundamentalists, but they were Christians that honored God, were persecuted heavily in Nazi Germany, and many were sent to their death. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a good example. But the point is that if you look at the churches as a whole in Germany, Hitler passed a law saying that the Bible had to be removed from the altar. And altar is a foreign concept to us, but in the Lutheran Church, it's the area you don't go into, and Catholic Church also. And instead of a Bible, you had to have a copy of Mein Kampf. I still remember my dad showing me a magazine from World War II. I wasn't alive then, obviously, but he hadn't kept it from World War II he'd purchased, that had a photograph of the German church with the Mein Kampf sitting on the altar in the Bible stand. They would have been better for those churches to not even call themselves churches, because today people say, well, gee, the Christians participated in the Holocaust. Well, that's not true. I don't believe the true Christians did. But to some degree, there's also some truth in that, because the churches who were the mainstream churches stood by and did nothing. They may have said, oh, gee, that's too bad. But that's all. When you take Mein Kampf and put it in place of the Bible on your church altar, you have definitely said the church, it's okay to go along with the state. In addition to that, think about this. I cringe with embarrassment every time I see the guys from Westboro Baptist come out. I don't want Okay, now we got the power back. Now we're losing the power. Boy, I talk about Westboro Baptist, this place gets pretty bad. All right. Think about this. What do you feel like when you see the guys coming up with the horrible signs about homosexuals, protesting military funerals because the military allowed homosexuals in? Man, I see that kind of stuff. I get terrified and I say, why in the world do they have to do it in the name of Christ? I'm not trying to say homosexuality is right. What I'm trying to say is that's not the way we're supposed to be treating them. And the fact is that it is absolutely wrong when this happens. And what I was going to say is, more than anything, I wish they just wouldn't use the name of God. Just, go be some jerk and don't claim God. That's the same thing you had here, is because God was saying, you're breaking the law and you're dishonoring God. We get to 24, the last verse here, and it says, For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, just as it is written. The Jews were ruining the name of God because they were acting worse than the heathen Gentiles. That's quite a statement. So again, they were acting worse than the Gentiles were. Again, not a good witness for God. Please, if you're going to speed down the road on the shoulders at 80 miles an hour, take the bumper stickers off your truck first and take the fish off your truck first. God doesn't need that kind of advertising. Now we get to application. First thing under application is no one is without responsibility except, all right, you hear some heresy coming up here? I warned my Sunday school class, there are people who are sinners, who never believe on Christ and go to heaven. And they're like, okay, what's he talking about? First off, what I'm saying is no one gets there except everyone has some kind of a law that we are accountable to, and everyone is responsible under God. Everyone has sinned, and because of that, we're all condemned without Christ. Now, the reason I bring up an exception is to say this. As we go further in Romans, I'm going to be teaching something about what we call the age of accountability. Many people ask what happens when an infant dies, and frankly, what happens when millions and millions of children are aborted every year in America and throughout the world. I'm saying to you, they go to heaven even though they do not believe on Christ. They're covered by grace. We're going to learn why later. And it's not wishful thinking. A lot of, frankly, the theology behind it, a lot of times is people using wishful thinking for the Bible. What I'm saying is through the book of Romans, we're going to be able to prove that children who are not old enough to, and even adults if they are mentally handicapped enough, go to heaven if they are unable to comprehend it. However, I think everyone in this room passes the category of we can comprehend it. So that exception isn't going to work for us. For us, it's simple. No one's without responsibility. Without Jesus Christ, we go to hell. With Jesus Christ, we're a child of God, we have a relationship with God, and we go to heaven. It's that simple. There's no way we can work our way to heaven. If you're thinking about working your way to heaven, or if you're watching this on the web later on and you want to work your way to heaven, it is not going to work. The second thing is God has no grandchildren. Remember in this, the Jews are relying on the law and their birthright. We're Jacob's children. We're the chosen people. Now we can look back and laugh on it. Well, how silly is that? Because of your nationality, you think you're going to heaven? Well, let me ask you a question. How many times you ever ask somebody if they're a believer or they're a Christian, and they look at you and go, well, I go to First Church of such and such. Uh-huh. That's like telling me you don't even have a clue what we're talking about. Because the church you go to is not going to get you into heaven. Just because we come here to Grace Brethren Church in Lanham every Sunday, none of us are going to heaven because we come to Grace Brethren Church on Sunday. I've said it before. If you sit in a Buick dealership, does it make you a Buick? No. If you sit in Grace Brethren here, does it make you a Christian? No. Sometimes we have the same mentality that the Jews had back then, except that instead of nationality, we're trusting on either our church we go to, or worse yet, I've met people literally, of course I'm going to heaven. My daddy was a Christian. My daddy was a pastor. My granddaddy was a pastor. Great, your granddaddy was a pastor. Now tell me something relevant to your salvation. They don't get it. The fact is, if we trust in church, we're doing the exact same thing that Paul was condemning the Jews for. So we can't really look, well, I wouldn't look down on them anyway, but we shouldn't be looking down on them because a lot of people do the same thing. And by the way, I'm not picking on people here because I have not heard people in our church doing that. The third thing on this I think is pretty obvious is avoid hypocrisy. God hates duplicity. Paul got emotional when he wrote this section. You can tell from the language. He was not happy, not a happy camper. Trust me. Paul didn't like what was going on. And the reason he was this upset was because it wasn't just that they were doing right. It was that they're wrong, rather. It was that they were doing wrong in the name of doing right and in the name of God. Hypocrisy and duplicity. We need to avoid that. We need to do what we are called to do. We need to let our works show our relationship. Our works will never get us to heaven, but our works will demonstrate the relationship we already have with Jesus Christ. And the relationship we have with peace with the Father as well because of this, and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Why? Because we should act like we are. Again, if I see a cat walk up to me and go, woof, I know something is wrong. As Christians, we're doing that quite a bit, because sometimes as Christians, we're acting like the world instead of acting like what we are. Our nature should say, if you're a cat, meow. If you're a dog, bark. As a Christian, if you're a Christian, act like it. And that's what Paul's talking about here. Or that's the application I would take from it. In addition to that, when you try to put on a hypocritical face, people usually see through it anyway. We don't get away with it. We think we do, but we don't get away with it. One thing I should say here also is, if we do something wrong, admit it. It's okay. We did something wrong. We sinned. Fine. We tell it and we move on. One of the things I'll never forget, I've told you about before, is all the people I caught in teaching college classes at WBC and LBC who were plagiarizing. Amazing number of people that were just taking literally half of their final papers or more in the paper itself was cut and paste from websites. I'm talking 10-page paper, you'd have 5 to 7 pages that were just cut and pasted. And they thought they'd get away with it. They didn't with me. But the one thing I will say is every one of them that did that, with the exception of one, I actually emailed them and I said, something like, congratulations, you got a 0 on your paper. Then I'd explain why. And I'd also send the paper off documented fully with clipping from the website, citing where it was and putting it in the comment column so they couldn't in any way. And you know what I got over and over again? People that even faced with the evidence would deny what they did. What are you talking about? How can you deny this? You know something? One person got mercy. He got a 2-grade deduction, but after a 2-grade deduction, he got to turn in a new paper and he passed the class. The reason? Because he came to me and he said, Professor Hafer, I was wrong, I sinned, I've not only offended you, I've offended God. I got caught in time, I did something I never should have done, and I am so sorry for it. If you can give me a second chance, I'd appreciate it, but if you can't, I understand, because I was wrong. That guy got mercy and got a chance to get the deduction and turn in another paper. If we do something wrong, avoid the hypocrisy. It's easier to say, I did something wrong. On this election, I'd love to see one of these 2 candidates stand up and say, you know, I really screwed up on that. You don't hear that. People appreciate it when you're honest without hypocrisy. We should be the experts that God expects us to be on salvation. I don't mean that we know everything, but I mean we know that Jesus is our Savior. And we can present that without hypocrisy. And we can tell people about Jesus. That's the even though he's speaking to the Jews here that were unregenerate at this point in time, that's the application I'm taking from this for how we should treat it today.